Imagine waking up one morning knowing that by sunset, everything you believed about your nation's invincibility would be ash. That is exactly what happened to the Imperial Japanese Navy on June 4, 1942. In the span of just 6 minutes, not 6 hours, not 6 days, 6 minutes, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled by any Asian nation in human history was gutted. 4 fleet carriers. Hundreds of the most experienced combat pilots in the Pacific. Gone. Burning. Sinking to the bottom of the ocean. But here is what makes this story unlike any other battle in the history of warfare. Japan didn't lose because they were outgunned. They didn't lose because they were outnumbered. They lost because of a secret. A secret the Americans were keeping. And a secret Japan was keeping from itself. This is the Battle of Midway. And once you understand what really happened, the hidden intelligence war, the impossible courage, the devastating miscalculations, and the 6 minutes that rewrote the future of the entire world, you will never look at the Pacific War the same way again. Let's go back to where it all begins. And it doesn't begin at Midway. It begins in the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, by almost every military measurement, a masterpiece. Japan's Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had orchestrated one of the most audacious surprise attacks in military history. 6 carriers, 353 aircraft, and a voyage across thousands of miles of open ocean conducted in complete radio silence. In less than 2 hours, they sank 4 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. The world was stunned. Japan had announced itself as an unstoppable Pacific empire. But Yamamoto wasn't celebrating. Not truly. Because this man, educated at Harvard, lived in the United States, understood Americans in ways most Japanese military leaders refused to, he knew something his own government didn't want to hear. He had said it before the attack. He had practically begged his superiors to listen. He told them, with the clarity of a man who had studied his enemy deeply, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Those words were not dramatic poetry. They were prophecy. And 6 months later, that sleeping giant would strike back at a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the world would never be the same. To understand why Midway mattered so catastrophically, you have to understand what Japan was trying to do in the spring of 1942. By May of that year, Japan had achieved something almost impossible to believe. In less than 6 months since Pearl Harbor, they had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and dozens of Pacific island chains. They had built an empire stretching across nearly a third of the globe. Their forces were advancing toward Australia. Their navy ruled the Pacific like an emperor who had never lost a single throne. The speed and scale of these conquests had created something dangerous inside the Japanese high command. Something psychologists call victory disease. The belief, no, not just the belief, the absolute certainty, that they were unbeatable, that their strategy was perfect, that their warriors were superior, that the Americans, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, would not dare challenge them. And in this fever dream of invincibility, Yamamoto hatched his next great plan. He would lure what remained of the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. He would destroy it completely. He would force the United States to the negotiating table. And Japan would secure its Pacific empire for generations. The bait. A small, strategically positioned atoll called Midway. Barely 2 square miles of coral and sand, sitting nearly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. But its location made it one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the Pacific. Whoever held Midway held the door to Hawaii. And if Japan held that door, the entire Pacific was theirs. Yamamoto assembled a fleet so massive it barely seems real. Over 200 ships, 8 carriers, 11 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, so enormous it had its own aircraft. Hundreds of combat aircraft, 23 submarines, tens of thousands of sailors and troops. It was the largest naval armada in the history of the Pacific, perhaps in the history of any ocean. Against this, the United States could muster 3 carriers. 3. And one of them, the Yorktown, had been so badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier that Japanese intelligence had declared it sunk. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, outcarried. By almost every calculation, they should have been destroyed. Should have been. Here is where the story takes its first breathtaking turn. And it all comes down to a group of men sitting in a basement in Hawaii who almost nobody has ever heard of. Station Hypo, a signals intelligence unit operating out of the basement of the Pearl Harbor Naval Headquarters. Their job was to do something that seemed mathematically impossible: crack Japan's naval code. A code so complex, so layered, so deliberately obscure, that Japanese high command was absolutely convinced it was unbreakable. They were wrong. Commander Joseph Rockefort was a man who had dedicated years of his life to understanding the Japanese language, Japanese military culture, and Japanese cryptographic thinking. He was brilliant, unconventional, stubborn, and frankly, a little eccentric. He worked in his basement office wearing a smoking jacket and slippers. His team worked around the clock in 20-hour shifts, surviving on coffee and the particular madness of people who stare at encoded transmissions until the numbers start talking back. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to break through the Japanese code, a cipher system called JN-25. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to catch fragments. Enough to piece together the outline of something enormous being planned. They began to see references to a massive Japanese operation. A target being designated by two letters, AF. F. What was AF? Rockefort believed it was Midway. His superiors in Washington weren't so sure. Some of them thought it might be the Aleutian Islands. Some thought it might even be the west coast of the United States. The debate was fierce, because the wrong answer meant sending the entire American fleet to the wrong location and losing the war in an afternoon. So Rockefort did something both incredibly simple and breathtakingly clever. He arranged for the Midway base to send a radio message, in plain, uncoded English, reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and they were running short on fresh water. Within 2 days, a Japanese intelligence transmission was intercepted. It reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. AF was Midway. That single piece of information, born from an act of deliberate, calm deception, may have saved the United States of America. Because it meant that Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, now knew exactly where Japan was going. He knew their target. And if Rockefort's team continued working, he might even know when they were coming. And that changed everything. Now, while the Americans were piecing together Japan's plan in secret, the Japanese were building their armada with total confidence. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanded the Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, the four-carrier heart of the operation. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu. These were not just ships. They were legends. The Akagi had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. The Kaga was one of the largest carriers in the world. Together, they represented the most experienced, most battle-hardened carrier aviation force on Earth. Their pilots were extraordinary. Many of them had been flying combat missions since the war with China in the 1930s. They had attacked Pearl Harbor, Darwin, Colombo, Trincomalee. They had sunk British battleships in the Indian Ocean. They were, without question, the finest naval aviators in the Pacific. And here is the terrible tension that makes this story so devastating. They were about to fly into a trap they didn't know existed. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was, on paper, sophisticated. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to the north would draw American attention away. Then the Kido Butai would sweep down on Midway from the northwest, soften it with airstrikes, and land invasion troops. The American carriers, if they dared respond at all, would rush to defend Midway and walk directly into a Japanese ambush. Yamamoto's battleships and additional carriers would be waiting just over the horizon, and the Americans would be annihilated. It was a brilliant plan with one fatal problem. It assumed the Americans didn't know it was coming. They knew. They knew everything. Nimitz deployed his 3 carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, to positions northeast of Midway, outside the range of Japanese search planes. They would wait. They would watch. And when the moment came, they would strike first, before Nagumo even knew American carriers were in the area. But the Yorktown. The Yorktown deserves a moment of its own. When the carrier limped into Pearl Harbor after the Coral Sea battle, the damage assessment said she needed months of repairs. Months she didn't have. Nimitz walked her decks himself, looked at the damage, looked at his engineers, and told them he needed her ready in 3 days. 3 days for months of work. The engineers said it was impossible. Nimitz told them to do it anyway. 1,400 workers swarmed that ship around the clock. They welded. They patched. They worked through the night with cutting torches and hammers and sheer human stubbornness. 3 days later, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't fully repaired. But she was battle-ready. And at Midway, that patched, broken, resurrected ship would prove absolutely pivotal. June 3, 1942. The day before the storm. Japanese forces attacked the Aleutian Islands, exactly as planned. For a terrifying moment, American command wasn't sure whether this was the real threat or the diversion. But Nimitz held firm. He trusted Rockefort. He trusted his intelligence. And he kept his carriers at Midway. That night, sailors on both sides of the Pacific prepared for what was coming. American pilots wrote letters home. Japanese sailors sharpened swords that had been in their families for generations. The ocean was quiet in that particular way oceans get before something catastrophic happens. On the Akagi, Nagumo sat with his maps and his certainty. He had no idea that less than 200 miles away, 3 American carriers were waiting for him in the dark. And then the sun rose on June 4th. And everything began. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first wave. 108 aircraft, loaded with bombs and torpedoes, pointed at Midway Atoll. The pilots were calm, professional, supremely confident. This would be a routine strike. Soften the island. Clear the way for the invasion force. Simple. The attack on Midway was, in purely military terms, effective. They hit runways, fuel storage, command buildings. American fighters rose to meet them and fought with desperate ferocity. Many of those fighters were outdated, slower than the Japanese Zeros they faced. Pilots died in their cockpits over the lagoon. The Marine and Navy aviators defending Midway knew they were outmatched. They attacked anyway, because that was all they could do. But here is where Nagumo's nightmare begins. Despite the damage, Midway's runways were still operational. The strike commander, flying back toward the carriers, sent a message that shook the battle from its rails. A second wave was needed to knock Midway out completely before the invasion could proceed. Nagumo faced his first great decision. He had kept his second wave of aircraft loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, the weapons you use against warships. If he rearmed them with land attack bombs for a second Midway strike, and American carriers suddenly appeared, he would be caught completely unprepared. But everything in his intelligence told him there were no American carriers in the area. His search planes had found nothing. The ocean was clear. So he gave the order. Rearm for a second strike on Midway. It was the kind of decision that seems perfectly logical until the moment it destroys you. Because at almost exactly that moment, the moment his mechanics began the laborious, dangerous process of hauling out torpedoes and replacing them with bombs, one of his search planes finally sent a message that changed everything. Enemy surface ships sighted. Nagumo's stomach must have dropped. He demanded clarification. What kind of ships? The agonizing reply came back. They appeared to include a carrier. A carrier. One carrier. Here. When everything said there should be none. Nagumo reversed his order. Switch back to armor-piercing weapons. Prepare for a naval strike. And so his mechanics, already partway through one rearming process, began another. Bombs were unloaded. Torpedoes were brought back up from the magazines. The hangar decks of 4 Japanese carriers became crowded with half-assembled aircraft, unattached bombs, loose fuel lines. The pilots were standing by, waiting, frustrated, not yet in their cockpits. Nagumo now faced a second problem. His first wave was returning from Midway and needed to land before a strike could be launched. Did he launch his partially armed second wave immediately, risking sending them into battle under-equipped, or did he wait, recover his first wave, rearm properly, and launch a fully organized, devastating strike? He waited. It was the second fatal decision. And he would never get the chance to make a third. While Nagumo's carriers were churning through their chaos of rearming and recovering aircraft, American planes were already in the air. And they were already dying. This is the part of the Battle of Midway that doesn't get talked about enough. The part that was not triumph. The part that was tragedy. The American attack was desperately uncoordinated. Different squadrons launched from different carriers at different times. Navigation was brutal over open ocean. Many groups arrived over the Japanese fleet to find it had changed course. Some squadrons turned back without finding anything. Fuel became a crisis. The carefully planned coordination of the strike fell apart almost immediately in the chaos of real war. The first Americans to find the Japanese fleet and attack were the torpedo bombers. Slow, low-flying, utterly vulnerable. Torpedo Squadrons 8, 6, and 3, men from the Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, came in low over the wave tops, throttles full open, straight into a wall of Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire that was, by any sane assessment, unsurvivable. Torpedo Squadron 8, from the Hornet, was led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. He had written a letter to his men the night before battle. He told them he felt certain they were heading into a fight with no return. He told them he believed in them. He told them he expected every man to do his duty. Waldron's squadron of 15 aircraft flew directly into the concentrated fury of Japan's air defense. Zeros slashed through them. Anti-aircraft fire tore wings apart. One by one, those slow, lumbering torpedo bombers went into the sea. All 15 were shot down. Every single one. Only one man from Torpedo Squadron 8 survived. Ensign George Gay, who floated in the ocean clinging to a cushion, watching the rest of the battle unfold around him. He was the only American to witness the battle from the water while it happened. The other torpedo squadrons fared barely better. Of the torpedo bombers sent against the Japanese fleet that morning, the vast majority were shot down without scoring a single torpedo hit. Dozens of young men died, their aircraft torn apart by Zeros and anti-aircraft, falling into the Pacific one after another in a crescendo of futile, devastating courage. It seemed like the battle was lost before it had truly begun. But here is the thing about war that makes it so impossible to predict. Those dying torpedo bombers, in their failure, achieved something their commanders couldn't have planned. Something that altered the entire trajectory of the fight. To intercept those slow, low-flying torpedo planes, the Japanese Zero fighters had descended. Way down, to wave-top level, chasing, shooting, destroying. The combat air patrol that had been circling at high altitude to protect the carriers had been pulled down, stripped away from the sky above. And the sky above was now empty. 4 minutes. Remember that number. 4 minutes. High above the battle, at almost exactly the moment the last torpedo bombers were being torn from the sky, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet almost simultaneously. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise's dive bombers, had been searching desperately for the Japanese fleet after finding empty ocean where his charts said they should be. He was almost out of fuel. His planes were running on fumes. He had a choice: turn back and save his pilots, or press on and risk losing everyone. He pressed on. And he found them. Below him, the Japanese carriers Akagi and Kaga were turning into the wind to launch their strike. Their decks were packed. Fueled aircraft loaded with bombs and torpedoes. Fuel lines running across hangar decks. Bombs stacked in corridors because the magazines were too slow to empty them back into. 4 months of careless victory had bred 4 months of careless procedure. And now those carriers were the most flammable objects in the Pacific Ocean. McCluskey rolled his aircraft into a dive. His squadrons followed. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown arrived over the Soryu. In the space of approximately 6 minutes, the world changed. The Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by 2 bombs. They penetrated directly into the crowded hangar deck. The fueled planes, the loose ordnance, the fuel lines, it all became a chain of explosions so violent that men were blown over the side. The flagship of the Kido Butai, the ship that had led the Pearl Harbor attack, became a column of fire. The Kaga was hit by 4 bombs. Her deck erupted. Her aviation fuel ignited. Men burned where they stood. Her captain was killed in the first moments. The ship became an inferno. The Soryu was hit by 3 bombs within 30 seconds. She was so badly damaged and burning so fiercely that her captain gave the order to abandon ship almost immediately. 3 carriers. 3 proud, powerful, veteran carriers. Burning. In 6 minutes. Nagumo, Japan's greatest carrier admiral, commander of the fleet that had humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor, had to be physically restrained from going down with his ship. He was transferred off the Akagi against his will, moved to a cruiser, stripped of the flagship he could no longer command. He stood on the bridge of that cruiser and watched his carriers burn. But the battle wasn't over. And this is where it becomes something even more remarkable. The fourth carrier, the Hiryu, had escaped the initial attack because she was positioned slightly apart from the others. And her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was not the kind of man who accepted defeat quietly. While Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned, Yamaguchi launched his counterattack. He sent his dive bombers after the Yorktown. They found her. 3 bombs crashed into the Yorktown's deck. She shuddered, listed, fires broke out across her. For a terrible moment, it looked like she would join the burning Japanese carriers at the bottom. But the Yorktown would not die easily. Her damage control crews were extraordinary. Men fighting fires with their hands, plugging holes with their bodies, pumping flooded compartments while bombs had literally just stopped falling. They brought her back. They slowed the flooding. They got her power back. They got her moving again. Yamaguchi sent a second strike, torpedo bombers this time. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown's port side. She listed so severely that abandonment seemed inevitable. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship. But even as her crew went into the water, American planes were hunting the Hiryu. Dive bombers from the Enterprise found her in the late afternoon. 4 bombs. A carrier that had survived the morning attack in perfect condition was now burning just like her sisters. By nightfall on June 4, 1942, all 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or mortally wounded. The most devastating carrier force ever assembled by Japan, the force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, was gone. And the Americans had lost 1 carrier. The Yorktown. That patched, repaired, impossible ship that should never have been at Midway at all. She was eventually sunk by a Japanese submarine while being towed to safety, 2 days after the battle. But she had fought. She had been hit, recovered, hit again, and still her planes had found the Hiryu. She went down the way she had lived. Fighting. Now let's pause the action for a moment, because this is where we need to talk about the men. Not the admirals. Not the strategy. The men. Wade McCluskey, who refused to turn back when his fuel gauges were begging him to. He landed on the Enterprise with so little fuel left in his tanks that his aircraft literally ran dry on the approach. The decision to press on rather than turn back, a decision made by one man, alone, in the cockpit, over empty Pacific Ocean, arguably determined the outcome of the entire battle. Of the entire Pacific War. John Waldron, who led his entire squadron into certain death rather than turn away from his duty. He never returned. But his squadron's sacrifice was the price that pulled the Japanese fighters down from the sky. The mechanics on the Yorktown. Anonymous men whose names history doesn't always record, who repaired a mortally damaged carrier in 3 days with welding torches and raw determination, giving America its 3rd carrier at a battle where 3 carriers were barely enough. The codebreakers at Station Hypo, sleeping in shifts in a basement, staring at encrypted numbers until the numbers gave up their secrets. Joseph Rockefort, who was so certain about Midway that he staked everything on it. Who, incidentally, was later denied a formal medal for his contributions because of inter-service rivalry and bureaucratic pettiness, one of the great injustices of the war. He eventually received the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously, decades after the battle, after most of the people who had wronged him were gone. War is never just strategy and statistics. It is men making impossible decisions in impossible moments with incomplete information and terrifying consequences. And at Midway, Americans made those decisions better than their enemy. Not because they were braver, both sides had extraordinary courage. But because they had better information, more desperate necessity, and commanders willing to trust what their intelligence was telling them. Let's talk about what Japan didn't know. Because the intelligence failure on the Japanese side is as remarkable as the intelligence success on the American side. Japan knew almost nothing about what they were sailing into. Their submarine picket line, designed to report American ship movements, arrived at their stations too late. The American carriers had already sailed past before the submarines got into position. So Japan's eyes were blind at the most critical moment. Their search plane protocols were inadequate. The one plane that eventually found the American carriers launched late due to a mechanical delay, and took a search pattern that covered its designated area last rather than first. If it had searched differently, it would have found the American fleet hours earlier. Nagumo would have had time to act before his decks were crowded with rearmed planes. And then there was the fundamental problem of Japanese planning arrogance. Their operational plan was so complex, so dependent on everything going exactly right, that it had almost no capacity to adapt to the unexpected. When the unexpected arrived, American carriers in the wrong place, at the wrong time, from the wrong direction, the Japanese system couldn't process it fast enough. Yamamoto, on the Yamato with his battleships, was too far behind the action to intervene effectively. His radio communications were restricted to maintain operational secrecy. He sat on the largest battleship in history, hundreds of miles from the battle, as his carriers burned. There is something almost Shakespearean about that image. The architect of Japan's Pacific dominance, sitting in his flag bridge, receiving fragmentary reports of catastrophe, unable to act, unable to change what was happening, watching through the lens of his communications equipment as everything he had built turned to ash. In the aftermath of the battle, something almost as strange as the battle itself occurred. Japan hid what had happened from its own people. The survivors of Midway, the pilots, the sailors, the officers, were kept in strict isolation. They were not allowed to communicate with their families. They were transferred to other units in complete secrecy. Japan's official propaganda machinery reported a glorious Japanese victory at Midway. The public was told the operation had been a success. Japanese newspapers celebrated. The men who had been there, who had watched 4 carriers burn, who had pulled their admiral off a sinking flagship, they were ordered to say nothing. For the rest of the war, many of them stayed silent. Think about what that means psychologically. You have just lived through the worst defeat in your Navy's history. You have watched your friends die, your ships burn, everything you believed about your invincibility shatter in 6 minutes. And then you are told to smile and say nothing happened. That it was a victory. The psychological damage of that secret, carried by thousands of men for years, is impossible to quantify. Meanwhile, in Washington and in Hawaii, there was an equally complex reckoning. The victory at Midway was so decisive, so stunning, that American leadership was almost afraid to believe it. They had intercepted communications, assembled their fleet on intelligence rather than certainty, and gambled everything. And they had won in a way that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. But they also couldn't celebrate loudly. Because to celebrate too visibly meant risking Japan learning that their codes had been broken. The secret of Station Hypo had to be preserved. The victory had to appear as if it had come from luck, from courage, not from cryptographic intelligence. So even in victory, Americans kept a secret. 2 nations. 1 battle. Both keeping secrets from the world. And both forever changed. Now let's talk about what Midway actually meant. Because I think this is where most tellings of the battle fall short. They explain what happened. They don't always fully explain why it matters in the way it does. Before Midway, Japan had strategic initiative in the Pacific. They chose when to strike and where. They chose the tempo of the war. The Americans were responding, defending, trying to stabilize. Japan was expanding, and the momentum of history seemed to be running entirely in their favor. After Midway, that was over. Forever. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was catastrophic in ways that went far beyond the ships themselves. Japan could build more ships. What they could not replace, not in months, not in years, were the aircrew. The pilots. Those extraordinary, combat-hardened naval aviators who had been training since before the war, who had honed their skills in China and at Pearl Harbor and across a dozen Pacific battles, were gone. Dead in the water around Midway or dead on the burning decks of their carriers. Japan's carrier aviation training program was nowhere near capable of producing replacements at the rate needed. The pilots who fought in 1944, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf, were shadows of the men who flew in 1941 and 1942. Less experienced, less trained, sent into combat before they were ready, dying in numbers that compounded the crisis with every battle. The Japanese carriers that were eventually rebuilt and repaired would go into battle crewed by young men with a fraction of the experience of the men they replaced. And it showed. Brutally. The strategic balance shifted at Midway, and it never shifted back. The Americans began their island-hopping campaign, moving across the Pacific, cutting off Japanese supply lines, bringing bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. Each island taken was another stepping stone. Each stepping stone brought the war closer to Japan's shores. Japan could not sustain the counteroffensive momentum it had displayed in the first 6 months of the war. The loss of the Kido Butai's core capability was simply too devastating. 6 minutes. 6 minutes. The mathematics are staggering. 6 minutes of dive bombing, and the entire Pacific War shifted its axis. There is one more thing I want you to understand about Midway. One more layer of this story that makes it perhaps the most extraordinary battle in the history of naval warfare. Midway was, in many ways, a battle that should not have been possible for the Americans to win. Not because of the odds, though the odds were terrible, but because of the number of things that had to go right simultaneously, each one of them seemingly improbable, for the result to occur. The code had to be broken. Partially, imperfectly, but enough. Rockefeller's team had to be right about AF being Midway, not some other target. Nimitz had to trust them over his own superiors who had doubts. The freshwater deception had to work. The Yorktown had to be repaired in 3 impossible days. The carriers had to be positioned outside Japanese search range. McCluskey had to refuse to turn back. He had to make the right navigation decision that found the Japanese fleet when his charts were already wrong. The torpedo bombers had to be shot down in exactly the right sequence to pull Japanese fighters low at exactly the right moment. The dive bombers from 3 separate carrier groups had to arrive over the Japanese fleet within minutes of each other, uncoordinated. The Japanese carriers had to be in the maximum state of vulnerability, decks crowded, ordnance unloaded, fuel lines exposed, at that exact moment. Change any one of those things, any single factor, and the battle ends differently, perhaps catastrophically differently. History sometimes looks like inevitability when you read it afterward. It never is. It is a chain of human decisions, human courage, human error, and sometimes, just sometimes, breathtaking luck. Midway was all of those things, woven together so tightly that separating them is almost impossible. In the years after the war, Admiral Nimitz called Midway the decisive battle of the Pacific War. He was right. But I think the word decisive almost undersells it. Midway was the moment the Pacific War went from being a contest of strength to being a race against time. Japan could not win a long war. Their industrial capacity was a fraction of America's. Their resources were finite. Their manpower pool was smaller. Their technological development, while brilliant in certain areas, was beginning to fall behind American innovation and production. They needed a short war. A quick, stunning victory that would force a negotiated peace before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. And Midway destroyed that possibility completely. In losing those 4 carriers and their priceless experienced aircrews, Japan lost its window. The brief period in which they had the power to dictate the terms of the Pacific conflict slammed shut at Midway, and it never opened again. What followed was 3 more years of increasingly desperate fighting, a grinding campaign across island chains and ocean expanses, a war that Japan's military leadership, those who were honest with themselves, knew could not be won. Men like Yamamoto knew it. He had known it from the beginning. He had told his government before Pearl Harbor that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year, but that after that he could make no promises. He was given 6 months. Then Midway came. Yamamoto himself would be killed in April 1943, when American fighters, tipped off by, once again, decoded Japanese communications, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Even in his death, the Americans' intelligence superiority played its role. The secret of Station Hypo reached all the way to the man who had started it all. Today, the site of the Battle of Midway lies in a quiet stretch of the Pacific that most people will never see. The wrecks of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were found on the ocean floor decades after the war. In 2019, oceanographic expeditions located the wreck of the Yorktown, lying in 17,000 feet of water, remarkably intact, a ghostly monument to the men who sailed on her. Those wrecks are more than metal. They are graveyards. Thousands of men, American, Japanese, went down with those ships or near them. They are down there still, in the permanent darkness of the deep Pacific. When you look at the photographs taken by those deep-sea expeditions, the encrusted guns, the barnacled flight decks, the eerily preserved interiors, It is almost impossible to believe that these silent ruins once roared with aircraft engines and burned with such ferocity that they could be seen for miles. Time does that. It turns catastrophe into archaeology. It turns the most pivotal moments in human history into museum pieces and Wikipedia articles and documentary voiceovers. But the men who were there, the men on both sides, lived those 6 minutes with every nerve ending they had. It was the realest thing any of them had ever experienced. The most vivid, the most terrifying, the most defining. For the survivors of the Japanese carriers, Midway was a wound that never fully healed. Many of them carried it quietly for the rest of their lives. The shame of defeat, the grief of lost comrades, the strange guilt of surviving when so many had not. Some of them didn't speak publicly about what they had experienced until they were old men, decades after the war, when the need to finally tell the truth outweighed the old orders to stay silent. For the American survivors, Midway was both a victory and a trauma. Men who had watched Torpedo Squadron 8 fly into certain death never forgot it. Men who had pulled colleagues from burning aircraft, who had floated in the Pacific waiting for rescue, who had landed on damaged carriers with shot-up planes, they carried those memories until the end. War gives and takes in ways that accounting can never fully capture. Here is what I want you to take away from the Battle of Midway. Not just the dates, not just the numbers, though those are staggering enough. I want you to take away something deeper. The outcome of World War II in the Pacific was not inevitable. It was not guaranteed. It was not written in the stars by the weight of American industrial superiority alone. It was determined, in significant part, by a group of sleep-deprived codebreakers in a basement, by a commander who trusted intelligence over assumption, by a fleet of mechanics who worked impossible hours on a damaged carrier, and by pilots who flew into situations they knew were likely to kill them, and flew anyway. Human decisions. Human courage. Human ingenuity and human sacrifice. That is what Midway was made of. That is what history is always made of, even when we tell it in terms of ships and strategy. The 6 minutes that destroyed Japan's carrier fleet were the product of thousands of hours of work, thousands of individual acts of dedication and bravery, years of preparation, decades of intelligence work, and a collection of pivotal moments where human beings chose to keep going when stopping would have been completely understandable. 6 minutes. And the world turned. The Pacific War continued for 3 more years after Midway. More islands, more battles, more men lost on both sides in numbers that still stagger the imagination. But the trajectory was set at Midway. The ending was written at Midway, even if it took 3 more years to read all the way to the last page. Japan never recovered the offensive capability it lost on June 4, 1942. It fought on with extraordinary determination and appalling sacrifice. Its soldiers and sailors showed courage that history must honestly acknowledge even as it judges the cause they served. But the initiative was gone. The window had closed. And in the summer of 1945, 3 years after those carriers went to the bottom, Japan surrendered. The war Yamamoto had warned would be impossible to win, the war that Midway had made inevitable to lose, came to its end. 6 minutes. 4 carriers. And the course of the world changed forever. If this story grabbed you the way it grabbed me when I first truly understood what happened at Midway, not just the facts, but the weight of it, then I want you to do something right now. Hit that like button. It sounds small, but it genuinely matters. Every like tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be seen by more people. That history told this way, not as dates and names, but as human drama, deserves an audience. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Because Midway is just one story. There are dozens more like it. Battles, moments, decisions, 6-minute turning points where the world held its breath and came out different on the other side. We are going to cover all of them with the same depth, the same detail, the same refusal to make history boring. And I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about Midway? Was it the code breaking? The 6-minute window? The torpedo bomber sacrifice? The Yorktown's impossible repair? Tell me what hit you hardest, because that conversation in the comments is where this becomes something more than a video. It becomes a community of people who believe that history, told right, is one of the most powerful things in the world. The men of Midway, on both sides of that ocean, deserve to be remembered. And you just made sure a few more people will remember them. See you in the next one.